Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. In its 43rd year in power, the Islamic Revolutionary regime in Tehran had only two supreme leaders, Ayatollahs Khomeini and Khamenei. They have both faced a similar dilemma, reconciling the top priority of survival for their structures, built in order to control the country, with their aspirations to export that version of Shi'ite revolution to all corners of the greater Middle East and beyond. The essence of this dilemma is the fate of the Iranian nuclear project. It was designed to give the outward push of the revolution an umbrella, but insisting on it endangers the very existence of this regime, while freezing it in an agreement would enable Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards Corps to fund their aggressive activities. What are the Iranians about to choose? Joining us to deliberate this question from Madrid, Spain, is Dr. Rafael Bardahi, who is the CEO of Worldwide Strategy and a former Spanish National Security Advisor. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us from Central Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Cooper-Vasser, who is the Project Director on Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us as well, General.
Thank you.
And with me here in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large and host of TV7 Watchmen Talk, Powers in Play, and so much more, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, give us a broader understanding. What is the current state of play vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear aspirations versus its expansionist policies?
So the dilemma facing the Iranian regime has been facing it for the last decade or so, is that they cannot have both. If they want to keep their nuclear project, and it is not even a valid assumption that they could do it because other forces may intervene and take it down, they cannot have their other activities and vice versa. So this was the gist of the JCPOA, which was reached in 2015. Now they are facing the same dilemma again, and it seems as if this is bazaar time. They are trying to squeeze the very last concessions out of the United States because they see that President Biden is quite eager to get an agreement, that he has already exposed his bargaining position. They too seem to want an agreement, but they want to get the maximum price for it so that they will have room for maneuver in the Middle East when they export their revolution, when they operate through proxies, and when they have the maximum funding which they can get once the sanctions are lifted. So because of the war in the Ukraine, all of the Vienna talks seem to be on hold. But obviously, behind the scenes, there are negotiations going on, and we are almost down to the wire.
Indeed. Well, this, of course, has to do also with the fact that all the points of contention at this point have nothing to do with the nuclear components of the deal. They're not related to this nuclear deal. It's more specifically about the Ayatollah regime demanding from the United States as a prerequisite to remove the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps from the State Department's list of designated foreign terrorist organizations. General Cooper-Vasser, I'd like to hear your position on this. Where do the Americans stand at this stage, considering the fact that, quite frankly, from the get-go, they have been quite vocal and quite resolved, at least declaratively so, about lengthening and strengthening the deal, and that the non-nuclear components of this agreement will not be touched, including the sanctions on the IRGC. Is this something that we could take the current American administration seriously about, or are we expected this to go southward with regard to America, quite frankly, again, succumbing to Iranian demands?
Well, I think, in every negotiations, there's this last hurdle that has to be overcome. And sometimes if you are smart enough, you give up on insisting on the last hurdle and take most of what you want. And unfortunately, the situation right now is that the Iranians were working under the assumption that the Americans are so eager to get the deal that they can get everything they want, including crossing the last hurdle, which is the Revolutionary Guards, taking them off the list foreign terrorist organizations. And this creates problems for the American administration, both with the regional powers, including Israel, and with Congress, because even some Democrats are very unhappy about the idea that the IRGC will be taken off the list. And so we shall have to see this maneuvering around the last topic that has remained unsolved. I think that from an Iranian point of view, they don't see really a tension here, because they can very easily give up on this last hurdle and get everything. They get the ability to spread their version of Islam in the Middle East and maybe beyond, because they're going to get a lot of money. And they guarantee their way towards having a big arsenal of nuclear weapons in less than 9 years, which is promised to them if they return to the JCPOA. So there's not such tension if they join the deal. And what they do right now is putting pressure on the Americans to give them everything, including the IRGC, by pointing to the Americans that if they don't do that, they can get to at least 1 to 4 bombs, or at least 1 to 4 enough fissile material for 4 bombs in a very short period of time. And since the Americans don't want to confront Iran, definitely not militarily, they have to give up. Otherwise, they will end up in a position where they have to do something, to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, as they claim they are committed to. So this is where the Iranian game is. They're trying to put pressure, and look, they've already produced enough highly enriched uranium and medium-level enriched uranium to have enough fissile material for 4 bombs within 4 months. For the first 2 bombs, they can get enough fissile material within 5 weeks, maybe even less. So this is where we stand right now, and this is putting a lot of pressure on the American administration, who is really risk-averse and don't want to, in any eventuality, to end up in a position where they have to confront Iran. That's where the two sides stand right now, in my mind.
Dr. Barahi, your take on this?
Well, what I'm hearing from Washington actually is 2 different things. One is that a school of thought saying the Iranian nuclear program is advancing, and the nuclear bomb in the Iran's hands is unavoidable. That's one thing. The second thing is also related to that, saying, okay, but as a nuclear power, Iran will moderate itself because we can enter into a mutual assured destruction relationship. Okay, having said that, if we look what is happening in Europe, in Ukraine, with the invasion of Russia, and the Russian nuclear threats to NATO, and the way NATO has backpedaling since the nuclear weapons were mentioned by the Kremlin, I think we need to recapitulate in how important and how aggressive our power will be with a nuclear capability. So I'm very concerned for those who in the American administration doesn't perceive the real danger of a new nuclear power in the world, particularly when it's Iran, when we are talking about.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, however, the Biden administration, at least declaratively so, asserted that it will not allow Iran to attain enough fissile material to develop one nuclear payload. With that being said, we do see indeed that the statements are one thing and what they actually do is another. Is this something that Israel is willing to contend with, especially considering the fact that, according to reports, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, while visiting Israel about a week and a half ago, mentioned in talks with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that the United States would like to hear more about the so-called Plan B and what Israel suggests. What can you tell us about that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, about the delisting of the IRGC. So this started 3 years ago in 2019 under President Trump. For the preceding decades, even though the Revolutionary Guards and especially the Quds Force were the prime perpetrators against American forces and citizens, It was not considered necessary to have them listed as a terrorist organization because they are part of a state. All the other organizations are groups which are not affiliated with any government. And once the IRGC were put on this list, Iran retaliated by saying that CENTCOM, the Central Command, is now a terrorist organization and they will act against it. On the ground, it did not change anything. The assassination of Qassam Soleimani had nothing to do with the fact that he was or was not on any list, much like Imad Murnia 12 years earlier was taken out regardless of his status. And by the way, Israel has a similar list, and for the last 10 years, only the Quds Force has been on it, and the IRGC in general is not. Even as Israel keeps demanding that the US not delist it, it saw no reason to list it.
How can you explain that?
Well, maybe it's just an administrative overlook, but in any event, there is an interesting play here between the United States and Israel. It is very convenient for the United States that Israel indicates, and more than indicates, even threatens to hit Iran if it tries to get to a threshold status. Of course, more than that will trigger an Israeli attack immediately. The United States, as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is barred from threatening a non-nuclear weapon state. The United States is, of course, a declared weapon state, and one of the provisions of the NPT is that such a state cannot threaten and, of course, cannot attack a non-nuclear weapon state. Israel is not a party to that treaty. Israel can do what it wants, of course, with American-supplied weapons. And if the Americans do not come out and say, listen, we are not going to allow Israel to do it, then the implication is that it will be done with American blessing. And just as a reminder, in 1991, when Saddam Hussein started launching his Scuds at Israel, Defense Secretary Cheney was asked what the United States will do if Israel responds in kind, if Saddam uses WMD. And he gave his blessing to it. He said that, yes, Saddam should consider it because Israel may very well do it.
Well, the situation between Russia and Ukraine, of course, indicates that it doesn't matter what international law dictates with regard to nuclear weapon states or not. If a country of nuclear stature has the capacity to attack, it will attack.
Well, Putin was cautious enough just to raise the alert status of his nuclear forces. Of course, everyone understood the signal, but he did not threaten Ukraine with chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. This was the interpretation of foreign governments. May have been the right one.
Well, General Kupil-Vasil, to what degree do you think, or at least from your experience, as you have, of course, represented Israel on numerous occasions with regard to the nuclear talks pre-2015, is the United States at this stage, with the same actors currently within the Biden administration, acting also back in 2015 as part of the Obama administration, tentative to the concerns of Israel and other partner states here in the region?
So the Americans are, of course, aware of our concerns because we raised it with them so many times. But that doesn't mean that they are going to really take care of our concerns, because as we see, the Americans are saying that they are going to make sure that the Iranians don't have nuclear weapons. But in fact, they just cannot make it happen. Because in 9 years, when this agreement comes to its end, the Iranians are going to have enough fissile material to produce a big arsenal of nuclear weapons, maybe 100 nuclear weapons, because there's no limit on the amount. And they are going to control already the technologies needed in order to turn this fissile material into a weapon. And what the Americans are going to do, it's going to impossible for them to stop this from happening. More than that, the Americans ignore the fact that what's going to happen in the meanwhile is that with all the money the Iranians are going to get from the unfreezing of their assets and from the income of oil that they're going to export, they will be able to spread their hegemony in the Middle East without waiting for having the nuclear weapons. It's going to be done based on the money, that they are going to supply better weapons and more weapons to their proxies in Yemen and in Hezbollah in Lebanon and elsewhere. And this is going to happen without, even before they have nuclear weapons. And the last thing that they ignore our concerns is that by being able to force on the Americans their will, they are going to tell everybody they won the war against the Americans, and everybody will take it very seriously. And this is going to have a very negative impact for the United States in the region. And it's coming in a time when the Americans are leaving the Middle East anyhow and minimizing their involvement and the readiness to use their capabilities in order to bring about a situation that is in line with what we want them to do. So we have a very big problem with the U.S. administration at this point, unfortunately.
Indeed, Dr. Badahi, we have multiple times communicated about lack of political will in the West to deal with multiple challenges, one of them being obviously the Islamic Republic of Iran. How do you see this also within European capitals, considering the fact that Iran is expanding the capacity of its ballistic missile capabilities, also to be able to reach European soil, of continental Europe at least? Is this something on the agenda within European capitals, considering the fact that also we have the E3, Germany, France, and Britain partake within the context of the nuclear negotiations with the Iranians?
Well, without being cynical, I have to say that governments usually are only able to deal with one problem at a time. So now all the attention is focused on Ukraine and on Russia for obvious reasons. But again, as I said before, the mention to put in alert the nuclear forces, the strategic nuclear forces of Russia, has been powerful enough as a signal and messaging that I think all Europeans are now rethinking what nuclear weapons means. No? We were living in a post-nuclear world, in a post-war war as well, and now everything has evaporated rapidly because of the invasion of Ukraine. So I think that some people in the capital, particularly the national security teams, are rethinking what Iranian could do with nuclear capabilities or nuclear weapons in the future. And that may produce some changes. But at the same time, as I said also before, there is a sense of inevitability. There's a sense of pessimism of our ability as a Western alliance to deal with the nuclear program. So it is complicated, but I think what is happening in Europe nowadays will at least mean something for the future of the European relation with Iran as well, for the better.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, there is another analogy from the Russia and Ukraine war vis-a-vis the situation between Israel and Iran at this stage, at least. The Germans have already announced the acceleration of increasing their defense budget, 100 billion euro, in addition to their 2% defense budget. This is obviously significant because the defense budget is far bigger than any European country, and Russia itself also. Israel now is in the process of force buildup, military buildup. The Americans are providing Israel with the various technologies, or at least most of the technologies that Israel wants and seeks to acquire. Is this now a arms race de facto when we're talking about Israel and Iran contending with each other for basically thwarting or foiling each other's aspirations in this region?
Well, the German case is not necessarily relevant because the Germans for many years have benefited from the American defense budget. They did not have to invest in their own defense because being part of NATO and having foregone any aspiration to acquire nuclear weapons, which they, of course, technologically are able to do within a very short period, as is Japan, they relied on the American nuclear umbrella while building up their economy. So now they are diverting some of their resources into defense. We have to see what it means. There is no direct correlation between input and output. We don't know what will come out of the German defense establishment. And as for Israel, Israel is still dependent on US military assistance, even though it can do without it. But for domestic political reasons, it has chosen not to. And just take the last month or so, there were several terror attacks in Israeli cities. The response has been to divert the equivalent of an Israeli division, army division, 14 battalions, from their training. They train for war against Hamas, against Hezbollah, perhaps even against Iran, even though the ground forces are not going to do most of the work. And they were now diverted towards counter-terror missions. And in addition to that, it is apparent that Israel must fund more and more of its police. This will inevitably take money out of the true military budget, because everything is security, everything is national security, but you must balance the various forces. So I don't see a real arms race. What we may see is a more proactive Israeli policy against Iranian convoys going through Iraq and Syria towards Lebanon and other such missions, even though it has been going on for the last 9 years anyway. Ever since 2013, Israel has been, first of all, a major actor in the anti-Iranian policy in Syria and also against ISIS. It has been kept mostly secret, but Israel should be credited with doing a lot of the work against ISIS.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program. There's less than 5 minutes to the end. So I'd like to ask quite a simple question, but it's a complex answer to satisfy General Cooper-Vassell. Is Israel prepared to take the extra mile? Based on its statements and voiced statements over the course of many years at this stage, with regard to properly preventing Iran from accumulating enough fissile material for the purpose of acquiring a first nuclear bomb?
It's very difficult to say. You never feel that you are already well prepared. You always want to prepare yourself a little bit more because always something is missing, and the situation is changing. The enemy is getting better equipped and has all kinds of new capabilities. So we have to keep learning the situation and preparing ourselves better. But basically, yes, Israel at the time from 2002 to study this threat, to get prepared to confront it, and had in mind exactly this kind of scenario, that the Iranians are getting closer to having the capability to produce a nuclear weapon, and then you have to act. So I think that since we are getting very close to this situation, Israel should be, or probably is, well prepared, can be better prepared.
Dr. Bardahi?
Well, from abroad, I think what you need is a kind of positive and clear narrative, so everyone, friends and enemies, understand that Israel is prepared to do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons in their hands. And I think it's a combination of political will and military capability, and also it's a combination of your offensive capability versus the defensive capability of Iran and the play in the region as well. No? And so things are moving. I wish that Israel is prepared, and if needed, because everything fails, we'll act on time decisively.
The model for an Israeli successful action is the June 5th, 1967 strike against first the Egyptian Air Force and then the Syrian and Jordanian and Iraqi air forces. And the secret of that success was that the Israeli Air Force and the intelligence community very cleverly analyzed the enemy as a system. They knew where it does not have hardened shelters. They knew when the Egyptian pilots take a break from the morning patrols to have breakfast, and so on and so forth. So Israel will probably analyze the Iranian system, which includes, of course, command and control, the various platforms, what Khamenei and the other leaders are doing at any particular time, their vulnerabilities without going into details. So if the need arises, one can count without being too complacent on Israeli ingenuity to find the answer.
Dr. Badahi, just shortly, are the Iranians convinced? Is there a credible military threat emanating from the United States, Europe, and Israel at this stage, or is it exclusively Israel?
I don't think the Iranians really believe that Americans will do anything militarily speaking. Sincerely, I think the current administration has no credibility at all, not only in Iran, but in the region in general, and even in Europe, for taking any decisive action. I don't know what the Iranians think about Israel, but at the end, it will be the only actor really to contemplate any action against the nuclear program.
It is very symbolic that the sky above Raphael's head is a sunset, and we are talking about the sunset clauses of the new JCPOA.
Indeed. Well,
I just want
General
to say
Kuperwasser, one word.
We have to remember it's not only Iran. It's Iran and its proxies. It's the entire axis that we have to be prepared to confront.
Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, going all the way to the Houthis in Yemen. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Kuperwasser, Dr. Badahi, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.